Greetings all, and welcome to Sprues. In today's video, we're going to be having a look at the kit which won the most recent inbox review poll on my channel, and that is the Airfix 1/72nd scale Gloster Gladiator Mark 1/2. So without further ado, let's get into it. So, as usual with my inbox reviews, we'll start out by having a look at the box, and then we'll have a look at the instructions to see how the kit goes together, and then finally we'll have a look at the sprues and the decals. So starting out with this one's box, as you can see we've got a usual Airfix more modern render by A. Toby of a Gloster Gladiator flying through a cloudy sky with a little Heinkel 111 in the background there. This scheme looks quite interesting. It looks like that the upper section here of the green and the earth camouflage are done in a darker tone and the lighter areas are painted on the underside. And it appears that there's a little spot here that's been painted over with a different shade, a little bit of patchwork. And we've got this red kind of flag looking marking on the roundel there, which is a bit different. It looks quite nice actually. I'm not always a big fan of the modern rendered look compared to the old box art, but this one looks quite nice. I like all the lighting, and the weathering on the wheels looks pretty convincing. On the side here we have the two different schemes included, and as you can see that two-tone darker section on the top and lighter section on the bottom is present on the marking guide there, so it looks like that's a part of this kit. And you also have a Belgian marking, which is a little bit different as well. Got the usual titles from Airfix. Up here we have a price tag. Now I bought this one secondhand from a mate of mine, but originally he would have paid 25 Australian dollars, not US, so reasonable price I would say for a kit like this, but we'll talk a bit more about that towards the end. On the top here, in usual Airfix form, we have a little bit of history about the Gloster Gladiator and about its service, some dimensions about the kit, including how many pieces are included. My favourite disclaimer on any model kit box is that contents may vary from those illustrated. Then we've got our markings again here with a little bit more detail. So Scheme A is number 615 Squadron from the Royal Air Force, based in part of northern France. I'm not going to try and pronounce that one. And it's a pre-war aircraft with the earlier roundels. And then the Gladiator here is from the first group of the Belgian Air Force in Diest in Belgium. Again, I've probably done that wrong, but it's another pre-war aircraft from 1938, which is interesting. Then we've got our colours included for a Humbrels range, and as you can see they've included some for A and Scheme B, as well as ones that are separate for each. So you can follow that one if you are picking up the paints at the same time. And in the corner here we have our Airfix flying hours, which is part of their club, and a little guide here for the skill. The skill rating I tend to take with a grain of salt. Some kits are 1 when they probably should be a little bit higher, but it is quite a small range. And as for the flying hours, unfortunately in Australia it doesn't really make sense to be part of the club as far as I've looked into it, just because shipping costs are so expensive from Airfix in the UK that it just isn't worth the money signing up for the discounts and all of that. But if you're in the UK, I've heard they're pretty cool. And then on the side here we've just got a repeat of the box art, and on the bottom here we have all the warnings about the glue making you dizzy and not feeding this to a child. Opening up the box, everything except for one of the decals is as this kit would be when it was brand new, which is cool. We've got all our sprues in their bag, which look pretty nice and tight, and it doesn't look like any have come loose, which is good. And we have another bag in there for all of the clear parts, which I am a big fan of having. It keeps them a bit more protected. Then we've got our instructions here, and we'll have a look at those next, plus our decals with the usual Airfix sort of cover film to protect them. As you can see, the one thing that's missing in this kit is a decal, which I've had a look on ScaleMates. It's decal number 1, and it is for the lower instrument panel, which is a bit of a bugger, but I'm sure I'll find a workaround for that. But anyways, we'll have a look at these instructions first. So the instructions are in more typical newer Airfix style. You've got the booklet format, which I'm a big fan of, rather than having those annoying massive fold-out sheets that get in the way of your workbench. On the front, you've got a little bit more detail about the history of the Gloster Gladiator. Then on the inside here we have our usual assembly icon instructions. If you're beginning modeling and this is your first kit, good to have a read of these, but otherwise they're all kind of common sense once you've got a bit more experience. But yeah, the icons are all quite clearly labelled, and they're all pretty common for Airfix kits. Moving on to the first stages of assembly, you begin with the cockpit, which is pretty typical. You've sort of got this floor section with a little bit of the rudder area and then these kind of frames where the seat would go, plus you've got a seat for the pilot and a little sort of headrest thing for behind him. Then we've got, looks like the compass, which sits on the floor there, which is pretty common in British aircraft from this period. And you've got a separate part here for the control column. Optional pilot, which is nice. Unfortunately, a lot of companies don't seem to be doing pilots, but Airfix have stuck to it, which I'm quite pleased with. Then we've got an option here to open up the door. To do that, though, you have to drill out a little hole here and cut out the door, and then you can glue a second piece here for the door in place. Otherwise, then you've got two pieces here for the machine guns, which you install to these little parts on the side here. Then you've got the installation of the cockpit floor assembly and a little bit of painting for the interior walls there. All of these are in Humbrol color codes, I should point out, which are usually pretty easy to convert, but otherwise they're pretty common colors that the Royal Air Force would have been using, or the British. Moving on, you've got an antenna, which for aircraft A has to be cut off. And then it appears that, I think that's just cutting them both off, but in another sort of view. So you've got another antenna here, which has to get cut off on the tail. Not if you're doing B, but yeah, if you're doing A, cut those off. Then we've got a second fuselage half, which you then attach to the other one here and seal up the cockpit. Moving on, you've then got a, looks like a front kind of cowling piece with two struts that have quite a lot of sort of attachment to them, which looks pretty strong and solid to this cowling. And one of these is actually your instrument panel. So you've got decals to add some instrument dial detailing to. As I've mentioned, number one is the decal I'm missing, so I'm thinking I might actually 3D print a new instrument panel and then dry brush and paint the dials by hand, but I'll have a think about it before I do this build. But moving on, you then attach the cowling with the two struts to the top of the aircraft fuselage there, and for the underside here we have the wings. You have an option at this stage to drill out these two holes for the classic black Airfix stand, which you can buy separately. Turning over the page, the next step here is the engine, which has quite a few little pieces to it. I believe it was a variant of the Bristol Hercules, if I'm not mistaken, or it was an engine built by Bristol. But the first part here is all of the exhaust system, which gets attached to the bulkhead for the engine. Then you've got a row of cylinders. I think it looks like a 9-cylinder engine there, with looks like some little air intakes or some sort of system for the engine, which gets inserted into the exhaust there. Then we've got a spool piece here for the propeller to attach to. I'm assuming you don't glue that to the inside of this piece here so that you can have the propeller spin, although I think that's what the black kind of square indicates, but it's not super clear. But then you attach this front gearbox piece with the wiring onto the front of the engine. And once you've done that, you can then assemble the engine cowlings, which have the rest of the exhausts for the underside here. And there's another front piece, and then two separate upper sections here. I suppose if you really wanted to, you could leave one of these cowlings off and have it a maintenance sort of diorama. Although I suspect you may want a slightly more detailed engine, but it still looks pretty decent for this one. Moving on, we've got the main struts for the outside of the wings. Interestingly, you've got this large kind of bracing piece, which I'm assuming is a bit of spare sprue. And the instructions are saying to leave it on until, I think, a later stage. Yeah, at this stage you cut it off at step 24, which I think is pretty clever. Gives it a little bit more strength and helps you to line up the parts. And once they're in place, you can then add that upper wing. Moving on to the tail section here, you've got two elevators plus the rudder, which come as single pieces for each one. Then we've got the main landing gear struts, and then we've got a little air intake here for probably the oil cooling system, just on the underside of the aircraft there. Moving on, you then have the landing gear, which has a separate piece for the tyre plus a separate one for the hub, which is pretty good. Means it's a lot easier to paint if you want to paint the inside tyre hub a different colour. You've actually got two different options for tyres. You've got one that's got a little bit sanded on it so that it has that kind of weighted effect, and another one for obviously if the aircraft is in flight, which doesn't have that effect to it, which is pretty cool. Looks like you've got to get the sides right so that the aircraft sits to the ground correctly with the weight on the tyre, if that makes sense. It looks like you've also got a little bit of care that you've got to take with getting the angle correct on these tyres, as they have a little bit of a sort of outward I think it's a toe or a camber, one of the two. Then we've got a tail wheel here, which is a separate piece, but no weighting option. It's just a single one, which, yeah, pretty good. They're a pretty small wheel anyways, so you probably won't notice too much. Next, we've got some machine gun pods, which don't seem to be optional as there's holes already drilled out into the parts, so perhaps it was a permanent fixture on all Gladiators. It looks a little bit like the 109 cannon pods, which were an optional modification, so not sure if you can leave that off on certain aircraft. Possibly though, but in this kit obviously both aircraft have it. But you attach both of those cannon pods to the underside of the wings there, and then it looks like there's a small ladder for the pilot to use when getting in and out. This kit comes with two different options for propeller blades. I believe one is a earlier single or two-bladed prop, probably made out of wood, and then you have a later three-bladed one, which I think was switched to metal later on in the Gladiator's service. But yeah, picking one for each scheme and then attaching it to the engine spinner there. And once you've done that, you've also got a optional starter handle for the side of the engine there, and you can cut off those extra supports that I've mentioned earlier on those struts. Option here to have the canopy open. It looks like you've either got a single piece if it's closed, or you have two pieces where one is the front windshield and the other one is a pre-molded sort of shut or opened position for the canopy. I personally would have preferred it if there was a three-part canopy because I like to have it that I can open and close it for animation purposes. But I'd imagine most modelers are a bigger fan of that if you want it in the open position, as obviously it's a little bit better molded. But yeah, nice that you've got the option to have the canopy open in the first place. And finally on the back here we have a rigging diagram which shows you the position for all of the brace wiring on the wings. Looks like it's pretty clear and relatively easy to follow, and it's really awesome that they've included this. I think most manufacturers of biplane kits will include some sort of reference for this in more modern kits, although it is not always the case, so pretty cool that Airfix have done that. I reckon when I build this kit, I will give it a go, since I've got a little bit of AK Interactive's thin rigging wire, so I'll see how it goes. It does well for the antennas and that sort of thing, so should do alright for this. It's just going to be a probably quite a fiddly and very dreadful process to go through, but that's biplanes for you. And the last thing we have in the instructions is our marking guides. And as you can see, we've got Scheme A here, which is a Mark II, hence the later three-bladed propeller, and the lack of that large antenna on the back here, which is interesting. And as I've mentioned, it's actually got a lighter sort of shade of the flat earth and the green on the underside, and a darker tone on the upper surface. But it looks quite interesting, something a bit different, and yeah, you've got that patchwork that I've mentioned before, and that rather interesting red marking on the decal. This aircraft also has on the underside the white and black halves for identification, so it's a sort of early war, pre-war scheme, which is pretty cool, nice and interesting. And for something completely different on the back here, you have a Belgian Mark I Gladiator, and it's done in a more of a khaki kind of olive drab colour on the upper surface, with looks like a bare aluminium underside. The wings on this aircraft were fabric, I'm pretty sure, so perhaps they were done in like an aluminium dope, but possibly the metal parts on the underside of the fuselage here were done in bare metal, and then, yeah, as I've said, aluminium dope for the fabric sections. And it looks like it's a the prop's been painted either pale stone, or perhaps it was a natural wood prop and that's just a simplification. But yeah, and it's got an interesting green stripe on it, so quite a cool scheme. I'm probably not going to do either of these ones, as my plan for this kit is to do it up as Roald Dahl's aircraft. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that there's any record of what its squadron code was, and perhaps it never even received one, as I think it was a pretty new Gladiator. So what I'm probably going to do is either use these roundels if they're from the correct era, or perhaps replace them with the slightly later ones, and then do the aircraft in either this two-tone scheme or just the regular sort of green and brown without the two different color tones. So yeah, these are pretty cool schemes, and I'm very tempted by them. The Belgian one looks pretty cool, but as I've said, I've sort of picked what I want to do with this kit, so unfortunately I won't be doing either, but they're pretty cool marking options nonetheless. Moving on to the plastic parts, as you can see this one has not been opened before, which is cool, so I will open it now. So in this kit we have three different grey moulded plastic sprues, plus we've got the clear one here. So we'll start off with sprue A here, which contains, as you can see, the fuselage halves here. And we'll have a little bit of a closer look at the detail. And as you can see, they've gone with recessed panel lines with some raised sort of rivets where appropriate. And then they've done a very nice job of a sort of fabric texture on the rear part of the aircraft. And yeah, it's all looking really quite good. And there's a little bit of detailing here too where the machine gun comes out, which looks pretty cool. On the inside of the fuselage halves, they've done a little bit of ribbing for the upper section of the cockpit, and then there's a little bit more at the lower part here, and then some guide pins to help line up various interior parts. So both fuselage halves are looking really quite good. There doesn't appear to be too much flashing. There's a few little spots like sort of there where there's a bit, but nothing too major at all. Here we've got our single or two-bladed propeller here, which looks pretty good. Not too much surface detail, but there are a few little rivets where the spinner would go. The rudder here with a little bit of a fabric texturing on it, which looks quite nice and subtle. The front of the engine cowling here, which looks pretty good, and there's a lot of markings on the inside here to help line it up so that you get it correct. The engine details here with the cylinders looks pretty good, and the exhausts do as well. There's a few little flashes, marks here and there on the exhausts, but nothing too visible. So yeah, engine details looking pretty good. We've got our two horizontal stabilizers here as single pieces, and they've got some very nice recessed panel lines and recessed hinges, plus there is a nice little fabric texture replicated on the surface. Got a few small bits here, including our spinners, the control column, which even has the little firing button and some nice details on it. The optional door for if the aircraft is opened. Then we've got our hubs here, which have a few scratch marks on them. I don't know if the camera's picking them up super well, but there are some like recessed scratches on them, which may need a little bit of cleanup, which will be a bit fiddly. Then it looks like we've got our intake for the underside of the aircraft. Not too sure what this piece is, perhaps another optional intake of some kind, which looks basic, but alright. We've got our little starter handle there, which looks like it's quite heavily molded into the sprue frame there, so that might be a bit tricky to remove without breaking. Our tyre, again, it's got a similar issue of being very close to the markings of the sprue there, which may make removing it quite tricky. Another little piece here, not too sure. Oh, it's another intake of some kind for the aircraft there with a little scoop on it. Looks like we've got our small compass piece here, plus the spinner for the propeller, and not too sure what this part is there, but it looks like it's got a bit of flash on it, and again, very closely molded to the trees of the sprue there, which will make it very hard to remove. We've got our pilot here, who looks pretty good. I like the surface detail on him. I can see all of his facial features and the little seat belts. It appears he's got a life vest on, and I think he looks reasonably accurate for a interwar or early World War II RAF pilot, so that looks pretty good, or RAF. Then we've got our struts here for the landing gear, which are got a little bit of recessed detailing on them and some nice square pegging there for the alignment of the wheels and the fuselage, so that looks pretty good. Got our two struts here with that clever piece of sprue molded to them to help line them up, which is, I think, a very neat feature. Got the upper part of the engine cowling there with a very interesting corrugated texture on the right side, and on the left there's a few raised areas where there are some access hatches with some little rivets for accessing them, and it looks like some sort of little hole there, perhaps for a filler cap of some kind, but yeah, it looks pretty nice. Not too much detail on the inside, other than some parts here to help line up the strut system, which looks pretty good. And finally, on this sprue, we have our cockpit floor section there, which looks pretty neat. We've got some rudder pedals molded into it, and some nice corrugated texturing there where your feet would go. And then we've got some holes to help line up the various parts, such as the control column and the seat, all looking pretty good. Moving on to sprue B here, the main thing we've got are our wings. And as you can see, they've got some fantastic fabric texturing on them. Even on the middle here of the wings, there's a bit of sagging, and then there's a little bit more tension at the front there, which looks absolutely fantastic. I think Airfix do some of the best fabric texturing, in my opinion, in a lot of their kits, and this is definitely a good example of it. Then we've got, of course, some recessed panel lines in a few areas, including where the control surfaces are for the ailerons, and there's a few little raised areas for some of the access hatches. Underside here, there's a bit more recessing and some holes to help line up the struts there. So this is obviously the upper wing. On the underside wing, we've got the strut lining up holes on the upper surface, obviously. And again, very nicely done fabric texturing with recessed panel lines. And there's a few raised riveted panels to access what I believe would be the machine guns, which are on the underside here. As you can see, molded into the wings is the area where the machine gun pod would go. And judging by the way this kit is done, it would probably be a permanent fixture for this aircraft. Looks like the Gladiator has flaps on both the upper wing and the lower wing, although normally it's just with the lower wing with biplanes, but that's interesting. I'll have to have a look. But yeah, it looks like there's some flaps on this aircraft. And on the underside, there's also a fair bit more panel lining and some metal access hatches for the area beneath the pilot on the fuselage. So yeah, looking pretty good for the wings. There's not an awful lot of flashing. There's a few little marks here and there, but otherwise really great, which is good as it means that you can very easily preserve that wonderful fabric texturing. We've got a fair few other bits to cover here. We've got, looks like the lower part of the engine cowling with our exhausts, and the exhaust holes are even drilled out, which is pretty fancy, I reckon. And yeah, front of the engine cowling here has some nice recessed details, plus those raised blisters on the cowling itself. Instrument panel with the struts molded into it, which looks like a pretty solid design. No surface detail on the instrument panel, it's just a flat area with the decals being the main source of any detail, which is why I'll probably have to do something about the main panel section here with the decal missing, but I'll figure something out. Like I've said, probably 3D printing. Then we've got our machine gun pods here with some nice little bits of recessed detailing. A little bit of flash on the end of the barrels there, but nothing too major. And they've appeared to have done a solid hole or a fully drilled out hole for the dispensing chute for the spent shells. Looks like these little pieces are for the engine, part of some sort of intake system, I believe. We've got our wheels here, and these appear to be the fully circular ones in the corner here. And then we've got our flattened ones with the weighting on the bottom of them. Making sure though to use the correct number for these, as obviously as I've mentioned you'll want to have them on the correct side so that the aircraft is sitting flat on the ground. Then we've got our machine guns here, which have a little bit of detail to the barrel but nothing too major on them. Separate cowling pieces here for the engine cowling. I think it'd be cool to leave one of these off, but I don't know if the engine is necessarily detailed enough for some people's liking for that kind of thing. But obviously you could get a aftermarket engine and do a nice easy maintenance diorama with those panels already molded off the aircraft. Then we've got our seat here with a massive gaping hole in it and a little square mark here, which I'm not sure if that's present on the Gladiator's seat or if that's to help line up the pilot perhaps. But yeah, detail on the seat is basic, but it looks serviceable. We've got our rear bulkhead here for what the seat attaches to, and there's a bit of recessed rib detailing on it, which looks pretty cool on this side. I don't think there's anything on this side though, but I think the seat might cover up that detailing. And finally, we've got a little piece here for, I believe, the sort of gearbox assembly, plus there's some wires coming out of it for attaching to the engine. So yeah, Sprue B looking pretty good. There's not an awful lot of flash, and the moulding on this one seems to be a little bit better in terms of how parts are lined up to the sprue, so it's easier to cut them out. So looking pretty fantastic there. And the last grey sprue we have here is Sprue D. Now this one appears to be an addition to the Gladiator. Maybe originally it wasn't included, but it has the Mark II 3-bladed propeller along with the spinner, and it also has the skis, which would have been included in one of Airfix's earlier releases of this kit, which was for a Finnish Air Force one. So the Gladiator was pretty heavily exported, and some of them were fitted with skis for winter operations, so that's pretty cool that they're included in this kit. If you missed out on getting the other release of this kit, you could get some aftermarket decals and use these plastic parts to make a winterized Gladiator, which is pretty awesome, I reckon. Obviously, I won't be using them as Roald Dahl was flying his in the desert, but pretty cool to have as spares. Maybe one day I'll do another Gladiator and do it up in a winter scheme with these skis. And the proper last sprue is Sprue C, which is the clear parts. So I'll open these ones up. As I mentioned, love that they're in a separate bag to prevent them from getting scratched. And the quality on these ones looks to be pretty decent. They're very nice and transparent, and they have a very shiny look to them, which looks pretty attractive. And as you can see, they're very curved shapes, so there is a fair bit of distortion on them if you're trying to look at my finger through them. And they are, yeah, they're reasonably thin though. So yeah, I guess it's just a very difficult shape to capture in molded plastic. I would be tempted to vacuform a spare set if I can get a little bit better at the technique. But obviously you could also buy some aftermarket vacuform ones, and that might be a good idea as these are pretty distorted from the curvature. There appears to be two variations of front frame of the Gladiator. You've got this one here, which is a little bit more curved, and you've got another one here with a sharper angle sort of going up for a different version. And subsequently you have two front canopy sections for these different variations. The front canopy appears to be a little bit better, but it is a flatter shape, but the rear section here a lot more curvature, so there is a bit more distortion. But really, for the amount of curving on this kit and for how small these canopies are, they seem pretty small compared to other aircraft. I think they've done a pretty good job. And the last thing to look at for this kit is the decals. Now, I forgot to point out on the box here, in the corner near all the warnings, there is a little marking here that says they're printed by good old Cartograph. So in typical Airfix form, these decals are going to be pretty good. And as you can see, the detail on them is fantastic. I'll even zoom that camera in, and you can read pretty much all of that really fine text. So the printing quality in terms of the detailing is great. Yeah, and all the colors appear to be quite good, and there doesn't seem to be any nasty imperfections or anything. As I've said, this kit is second-hand, so missing that one decal there, and there could be a few little marks, like I think there is one there on the K from this one being opened up and then moved about. But for the most part, they look pretty good. So that pretty much wraps up our look at the Airfix Gloster Gladiator Mark 1/2 in 1/72 scale. On the whole, it seems like a really good looking kit. There are a few areas I'm a bit concerned about, such as the distortion on the canopy, which is a bit hard to avoid unless you go vacuform. And of course, some of those smaller parts on that sprue, which were rather close to the trees, might be a little bit tricky to clean up. But for the most part, detail looks really quite great. Molding quality is good, decals look fantastic, so I think this is a pretty good kit. I did have a little look online just to make sure there wasn't anyone noting any major issues in terms of the accuracy of this kit, but no one seemed to be saying anything negative about this one. I'm not really a rivet counter myself, so I'm not really one to comment too much on the accuracy of the shaping and all of the details. But for the most part, it looks like an accurate kit of the Gloster Gladiator, and I really can't think of any others in 72nd scale that are to this same level of detail. So yeah, pretty great kit. I'm looking forward to getting around to building this one eventually, and as I've said, might have to replace that instrument panel with something to compensate for the missing decal, and maybe replace the canopy frames, but I'll see how I'm feeling with this one. Obviously, if you wanted to, you could get a lot of aftermarket decals, as the Gladiator had quite a varied service history and was exported quite heavily. I believe Airfix have reissued this one quite recently again with some different markings, so hopefully they haven't made it too much more expensive. I know they have with some of their other kits, which I think is a little bit insane, but when this one came out, it was 25 AUD, which I think is a pretty good price for this kit, especially considering all of the optional parts and the level of detail. Some of their smaller ones, like the Spitfire, would usually go for around about 20, but you've got an extra set of wings here, plus all those other little extra bits, and it does seem to be a little bit more detailed than their basic Spitfire kit. So that's pretty cool. I think it's a good kit. Maybe not the best for beginners with all the fiddly little parts here and there. And obviously it's a little bit more complicated than most monoplane aircraft. But if you've had a bit of experience, I would definitely recommend giving this one a go, and yeah, it looks like a fantastic kit. So that pretty much wraps up our look at the Airfix Gloster Gladiator. I do hope you enjoyed this video and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel, as it really helps out. A massive shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund buying these kits and the products that I use to make them. I will do a build video on the Gladiator somewhere down the line, although there are a few other projects going on at the moment. What I'm thinking I'll do is continue to do the one inbox review and one build video per week and see how I go. Maybe some weeks it'll just be one video, but at the moment I'm sort of able to do two, so as long as I can do that, I will keep doing it. But anyways, thanks again for watching, and of course, until the next video, take care and model on.